Jeffrey Dahmer talks about his obsession to kill and why he got away with it for so long.
No one had a clue as to what was happening for over a decade.
If you were out on the street now, would you still be committing the crimes?
Probably. If this hadn't happened, there's no doubt I probably would be.
I know my time in prison will be terrible, but I deserve whatever I get because of what I have done.
Jeffrey, I hate you, motherfucker! I hate you!
The story of Jeffrey Dahmer is one that is considered to this day one of the most disturbing cases that's ever unfolded. The child that grew up known to be a happy kid would one day take a very unexpected turn, with him becoming known as a Milwaukee monster. May 21st, 1960, Jeffrey Dahmer was born by parents Lionel and Joyce Dahmer, and his upbringing was as normal as it came, which resulted in him being a happy and normal child. Up until around 4, this is when it kind of changed, and this was because he would undergo a surgery for a reported double hernia. And then not long after this, the birth of his younger brother came around, and the family decided to move to Ohio. And not long after the arrival of the baby boy is when this resulted in Jeffrey ultimately being ignored by his parents, as he had to take care of the newborn. But Jeffrey didn't see it this way, and then this is where Jeffrey started to take fascination for animal bones. And this is when his father, who was a scientist, believed his son was taking an interest in biology. So when he saw that Jeffrey was collecting dead animals, he taught him how to bleach and preserve their bones, and later this would be the same technique he'd use to his victims. Moving on to his teen years, nothing much really changed. He was described as disengaged, tense, and largely friendless. It was as early as 14 that his urges for necrophilia and murder became very apparent.
Yeah, I remember doing that.
So that's the point at which it shifted from animals to people.
Years 14 or 15 in that area, yeah.
And also around the same time is when his parents were going through a really ugly divorce, which was down to the pair constantly arguing in the house, causing constant tension. So why does this affect Jeffrey? Well, he turned to alcohol as a coping mechanism, to the point he would bring it to school and would drink it like it's his juice. He turned up to class drunk, he kept the bottles in his locker, and people ended up believing that Jeffrey was a loner, and clearly had some sort of problem, but none of them knew to what extent it would go to. It was also rumoured that his sexuality played a part in his excessive drinking. As he grew older, his alcohol consumption would spiral out of control, and this is sadly how it got the best of him, and his first murder would be committed. He just finished graduating from Revere High School in June 1978, where on the way home he picked up an 18-year-old hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks, who was on the way to meet his friends at a rock concert in Ohio. To which, when he told Jeffrey would say that it would give him a ride and a few beers to take. And when the time came for Stephen needing to get going to the concert, this is when Jeffrey started to become strange and made Stephen very uncomfortable. And then it was Stephen's decision to walk up and leave, and walk the rest of the way, passing the opportunity of getting a lift. And as Stephen was leaving, Dahmer struck him with a dumbbell, round the back of his head, and proceeded to strangle him with a dumbbell handle, which resulted in sadly killing him. Jeffrey then dissected Stephen's body and dissolved it in acid, and then buries the remains in a wooded ravine. Around the same time is where he dropped out of Ohio State University, after the first quarter term. So at this point in Jeffrey's life, he's obviously in need for some serious help. His dad would see that, but he did not know what Jeffrey was getting up to. Despite this fact, he said to Jeffrey that he should enroll in the army. And Jeffrey, after pondering on the idea, he decided to listen to his dad and would enroll in December 1978, hoping that this would get his life back on track. But his time in the army would last only 3 years, because his drinking habits didn't go away, and so the army would discharge him for that reason. Following his discharge from the army, he returned back home to Ohio, and shortly after, he would get arrested for disorderly conduct. And this would make his father send him to live with his grandmother, Catherine Dahmer, in Wisconsin, hoping that he would get back into a normal life. But this was the complete opposite. He was arrested again in the following summer for indecent exposure, and then arrested again because 2 boys accused him of masturbating in front of them. And as a result of this, he would receive 1-year probationary sentence. It wasn't until September 1987 that Dahmer took his second victim, who went by the name of Stephen Toymey. They checked into a hotel room and they drank the night away. Dahmer would wake from his sleep to realise that Stephen was dead and with no memory of the night before, but he later told the police that his intention was to drug Stephen, not to kill him.
One time I brought this young man back to the hotel room, the Ambassador Hotel. Was just planning on drugging him and spending the night with him. I had no intention of hurting him. When I woke up in the morning, he had a broken rib here. I was heavily bruised. Apparently I had beaten him to death with my fists.
And he couldn't believe that it happened. He would bring a large suitcase to transport the body to his grandmother's basement, where he would dismember on the corpse before disposing the remains, but kept the head, which was wrapped in a blanket for weeks after the murder. Dahmer later admitted that after the killing of Stephen, his obsession went into full swing.
And you have no memory
I
of
have
it?
no memory of it, but that's what started the whole spree all over again.
He killed a further 2 more victims at his grandmother's house before she eventually forced him out of the house in 1988. She sadly had no idea what her grandson was getting up to, but she was tired of the excessive drinking of alcohol, his tendencies of bringing young men back to her house, and then the foul smell that was occasionally coming from a basement. In 1989, he was held at a trial for child molestation. Dahmer was a model of contrition, arguing eloquently in his own defense. This seemed to be where Dahmer realized his wrongdoings, but nothing was going to change. His defense counsel argued the fact that he needed treatment and not incarceration, to which the judge agreed and would give Dahmer a 1-year prison sentence on day release, to which during the day he'd work at his day job and during the night he'd be in a prison cell. Years later, his father had an interview with the CNN, and he said that he wrote a letter to the court that issued Jeffrey's sentence, requesting that his son get psychological help before his son's parole. However, Jeffrey was granted early release after serving 10 months of the 12 he was given. He briefly lived with his grandmother following his release, during which time did not appear to add to his body count, before moving back to his own apartment. And then this is just where it gets unbelievably sickening. Over the next 2 years, he would commit 12 more murders, which unfortunately made his victim count at 17. The first victim was a prostitute named Raymond Smith, to which Dahmer lured him into an apartment for sex. He gave him a drink that had sleeping tablets inside and then would strangle him before dismembering his body. And with his next victim, Edward Smith, Dahmer accidentally destroyed his skull while trying to bake it in the oven, making it explode. He later told the police that he felt rotten about Smith's murder because he was unable to keep anything from the body. As time went on, Dahmer got more sickening ideas. In this consisted of experimenting with chemical means of disposal and often consuming the flesh of his victims. He also attempted crude lobotomies, and this is where he'd drill into the skulls of his victims whilst they're alive. And he'd done this on his 11th victim, Errol Lindsay. Whilst he was still awake on the sofa, he drilled into his head and injected him with muriatic acid. On the 27th of May 1991, Sandra Smith, Dahmer's neighbour, rang the police and reported a naked Asian male running down the street. And when the police arrived, the boy was incoherent, and as a result of this, they accepted the word of Dahmer. And after the event, they would escort both back home. And they didn't take a hard look inside of the home of Jeffrey. In fact, Jeffrey said that the police officer peeked his head around in the bedroom, but didn't really take a good look, and then left after telling Dahmer to take care of the boy. Once they left the scene, Jeffrey injected hydrochloric acid into the boy's brain, killing him. Had the police conducted even a basic search, they would have found the body of his 12th victim, Tony Hughes. Dahmer killed 4 more men before he was finally arrested. One of his last victims was Oliver Lacey, who was 24. Dahmer's killing spree ended when he was arrested on July 22nd, 1991. The body parts found in Dahmer's refrigerator and Polaroid photographs of his victims. 2 Milwaukee police officers were led to Dahmer when they picked up Tracy Edwards, a 32-year-old black man who was wandering the streets with handcuffs dangling from his wrists. They decided to investigate the man's claim that a weird dude had drugged him and restrained him. They arrived at Dahmer's apartment where he calmly offered to hand the keys for the handcuffs. Edwards also claimed that there was a knife, to which Jeffrey threatened him with, that was in the bedroom. And when the officer went in to corroborate the story, he noticed Polaroid photographs of his dismembered bodies lying around. Dahmer was subdued by the officers, after which he muttered the words, "For what I did, I should be dead." Subsequent searches revealed a head in the refrigerator and 3 more in the freezer, and a catalogue of the other horrors, including preserved skulls, jars containing genitalia, and an extensive gallery of markable Polaroid photographs of his victims. Dahmer's trial began in January 1992. Given that the majority of Dahmer's victims were black, there was a considerable racial tensions. So strict precautions were taken, including an 8-foot barrier of bulletproof glass that separated him from the gallery. Dahmer initially pleaded not guilty to all charges, despite having confessed to his killings during the police interrogation. He eventually changed his plea to guilty by virtue of insanity. His defense then offered the gruesome details of his behavior, as proof that only someone insane could do such terrible acts. The jury chose to believe the prosecution's assertion that Dahmer was fully aware that his acts were evil and chose to commit them anyway. On February 15th, 1992, they returned after approximately 10 hours deliberation to find him guilty, but sane on all counts. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms in prison. Dahmer reportedly adjusted prison life well at the Columbia Correctional Institution in south central Wisconsin. Though he was initially kept apart from the general population, he eventually convinced authorities to allow him to integrate with other inmates. And then Jeffrey was killed on November 28, 1994 by fellow inmate Christopher Scarver. In accordance with his inclusion in regular work details, Dahmer was assigned to work with 2 other convicted murderers, Scarver and Jess Anderson, and after they had been left alone to complete their tasks, guards returned to find that Scarver had brutally beaten both men with a metal bar from the prison weight room. Dahmer was pronounced dead after approximately 1 hour, and Anderson died days later with his injuries. A prison guard claimed that shortly after the murders, Scarver, who was believed to be a schizophrenic, said, "God told me to do it." Catherine Lacey, the mother of Dahmer's victim, Oliver Lacey, said the death brought her no closure. She said, "The hurt is worse now, because he's not suffering like we are." In 1996, following Dahmer's death, a group of Milwaukee businessmen raised more than $400,000 to purchase the items he used for the crimes. In August 2012, nearly 2 decades after his death, it was reported that Dahmer's childhood home in Bath, Ohio, where he committed his first murder in 1978 and buried his victim, was on the market. Its owner, musician Chris Butler, stated the property would make a great home, as long as a buyer could get past the horror factor. The house was removed from the market and is still believed to be owned by Butler as of 2022.